topics today are coping skills, social support, and then finally psychological distress. So in terms of coping skills, what do I mean by coping skills? I really think quite broadly about coping skills. And I think that a coping skill is anything that you do to help yourself shift gears, de-stress, or relax. And one of the points that I want to make right off the bat is that nobody is starting at zero. So everybody who's here listening in on the webinar, just to acknowledge and be aware that you already have some coping skills for sure. And think about those. What are they? And what coping skills work well for you, either now or in the past. And I mentioned the past intentionally because often, right when life gets most stressful, that's when some of our coping skills go by the wayside, either simply because we're highly stressed or because our time is being taken up. And so we don't have time to exercise regularly or take a half hour to read that fun novel. And so just when you really need to be doing coping and taking care of yourself, those things get pushed out the window. So to think about what has worked for you now or in the past that you could bring back and use in this current situation, and to remember to be intentional. Just having coping skills is one thing, but making sure that you're actively using them is an important step as well. So step one is making the most of your existing coping skills that you've already got. And then the next thing is to consider whether you need to develop additional coping skills. Some people feel like absolutely they really need to develop additional coping skills, and other people feel like, you know, maybe they've got everything they need, although it's often useful to keep an open mind, and there's always something more to be learned, and there may always be some additional things out there that are going to be useful for you. On this slide, I've got a long list of coping skills, and this really is not at all comprehensive, but it's just to get some ideas out there. And if you feel like you do want to develop some additional coping skills, start exploring and keep an open mind. You know, it may be that your initial thought is that breathing techniques or journaling really aren't for you. And indeed, they may not be the best fit for you, but you won't know until you give them a good try. So keep your pores open, keep your mind open. Think about trying some new things and see if they're actually more useful than what you had thought. And in terms of coping skills, it's handy to have some coping skills that you can do in really short bursts, 5 minutes or less, and that you can do in any location. So for example, for a lot of people, physical activity is a great coping skill, but often that requires equipment, and you need at least 20 minutes. And so even though that's certainly useful, it's also great to have some things in your repertoire that you could do any place at any time. And a perfect example of that is breathing techniques. So even just 30 seconds or 1 minute of breathing techniques where if you can shift gears and really focus on your breathing in a way that helps you to de-stress and calm down, that's something that you can do and feel a difference within 30 seconds or a minute. And you've always got your breath with you. So if you're sitting in traffic or at the doctor's office in the waiting room and need something to help you relax, it's great to have some coping skills like that. It doesn't have to be breathing techniques. Anything that you can pull out quickly and anywhere, that's really useful. So to kind of intentionally try to develop things that you can do in short bursts and anywhere, as well as those longer things, where if you have 20 or 30 minutes that you can really focus on doing something that's pleasurable, that's great too. So, and as I mentioned, I think of coping skills quite broadly. One way of thinking about coping skills is things that you do. I like to read. I like to exercise. Those are activities that you do. But another important coping skill is simply ways of thinking about stressful situations. And so one example of ways of thinking is having a sense of humor. And I want to acknowledge that I think that having a sense of humor counts as a coping skill, and really that's a humongous coping skill. If you have the ability to kind of step back and see a situation from a different angle, that's extremely useful. And acknowledging that not all situations are humorous, but if you have the ability to step back and see the funny side and laugh through the tears at times, that can be very, very useful. Another ways of thinking coping skill is remembering to stay in the present and don't spend too much time thinking about the future. And with that, the question is, what does too much time mean? Because there are certainly useful ways of thinking about the future as well as less useful ways of thinking about the future. So making concrete plans for the future definitely is helpful. General worrying isn't. And so if it's that just a repetitive thought that's just going round and round in your head like a broken record, that type of thinking about the future generally is just kind of, fueling feeling worried or upset. But being able to, if you notice that you're doing that, being able to say, okay, I think there's a valid concern here. What's a way I can break that down and do something concrete or useful with that? And so it can be very helpful to become aware of what your automatic thoughts tend to be. So for example, if you get a voicemail message from your doctor asking to call back, what is your automatic thought or reaction? Do you tend to think, oh, something is wrong, jumping to conclusions, kind of catastrophizing? If that type of pattern is true for you, it can be very useful to challenge yourself to think differently. And you can catch yourself doing that type of thinking and learn to replace those thoughts and say, oh, I'm amping up my own worries by jumping to a conclusion. I'm going to bring myself down by thinking differently and telling yourself something along the lines of, I don't know if there's something wrong. I'll reserve any conclusions until we talk. In terms of illness-specific coping skills, one thing to think about is, can you lighten your load or simplify your life? And part of that comes down to really thinking through what's most important to you and what's most meaningful in your life. And then thinking about whether you're spending precious time or energy on things that aren't actually worth it. And it's very easy for all of us to wind up kind of getting sucked into spending time doing things where at the end of the day or at the end of the week, if you step back and think about it and you think, gosh, I put a lot of time and energy into some things that really aren't worth that time and energy that I spent. And if you do feel like that's true for you, then it's time to think about starting to say no to things, which can be very hard. So are you comfortable saying no? Are you comfortable with the idea of prioritizing your own self-care? For some people, they're very uncomfortable with the thought of making themselves top priority, and they're more comfortable with focusing on other people, helping other people, and there's nothing wrong with that. But at some point, all of us need to draw a line and say that I need to be number one at some times too. And especially with a chronic health condition, with limited energy and fatigue, it's all the more important to say that you deserve to and need to be top priority at times, and to get comfortable within yourself with that idea. So, and in terms of, to continue with that idea of simplifying your life, I want to acknowledge that it's not just about scheduling or time management. it goes a lot deeper than that. I mean, how you spend your time and what you do influences your identity and how you think about yourself. Back to the idea that I just mentioned, are you able to make yourself a priority, or does just the thought of making yourself top priority, does that make you uncomfortable? And think that through, and if that does make you uncomfortable, I would hope that you're able to challenge that discomfort and to hopefully get more comfortable with the idea or the mindset that you get to be top priority and you need to be top priority. If you think that you might make some changes and start saying no to things that you've been involved with, or if you tend to be a yes person, people come to you and ask you to do things, and you like to do that and you like to say yes, but now with more limited energy, you might need to say no. And if you do start saying no, I just want to acknowledge that indeed there are likely to be some external challenges. When people are used to you saying yes, if you say no, they might not accept it right away. They might figure if they ask twice or 3 times, you'll say yes again, just like you always did. And so just to be prepared for that up front, that there may be some pushback, and to be ready to stand your ground and to be comfortable doing that. The internal challenges to that is your own discomfort at changing how you do things and at saying no when you've always been someone who said yes. So just to be prepared for that internal discomfort, and to think about it, that discomfort isn't a sign that you're doing the wrong thing in making some changes and saying no, but rather just that discomfort is kind of something that naturally occurs when you make any changes, but it doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. So I think I've already sent these messages loud and clear, but that taking care of yourself needs to be a priority, and you don't have energy to waste. And so I want to encourage you to give yourself permission to do things differently, to say no, to let some things go, at least temporarily. And that idea of temporarily might be really useful to you. So if the thought of really changing, if it feels like I'm asking a lot and suggesting that you change kind of who you are or how you do things, if that feels overwhelming and too much, think of it as an experiment possibly, or something that's temporary. It's not that you're going to say no to everyone and everything from here on out, but maybe you want to think about what things you would tackle first. That you know you're going to get asked to chair the bake sale because you always do, and that's something you want to let go this year. And to think about doing it, which specific activities are you going to say no to, and you can think about it as a temporary thing. I'm saying no, I'll say no to the bake sale this year. That doesn't necessarily mean no forever. And in all of this, I'm not saying that this is easy, but I'm saying that it's a struggle. It's worth the effort. And truly, with everything that I'm talking about today, and especially anything where it's a suggestion to think differently or do things differently, I think I would be doing people a real disservice to try to send this message that it's oh so simple, or that by the end of this talk there is not going to be a slide with 3 easy steps to permanent happiness. It's making changes is hard, and coping your way through day by day is not necessarily easy. But it is a struggle that's really worth the effort and that can make a difference over time. So more on illness-specific coping skills. As a patient, are you being too hard on yourself? Do you feel guilty for having a chronic health condition, for how that health condition may affect your family? Do you blame yourself for getting ill? Whether there's any connection between your health condition and anything that you would or wouldn't have done. Often we tend to feel guilty and blame ourselves regardless of if there's any logic underpinning it. It's just how we tend to feel. And those feelings can be hard to shake. But if you do tend to have a lot of guilt and self-blame, the problem with that is that that's really a burden. That's an extra burden on top of everything else you're dealing with, to carry around those heavy, burdensome feelings. And it'd be nice if there's a way to get rid of those feelings. I saw on the Pulmonary Hypertension Association website that they have a wealth of resources, and one of the things up there was I think it's an archived webinar that already happened on survival guilt. And so just it's an important additional burden that people often take on. With everything, it's easier said than done to kind of just, I can't say, oh, just don't feel that way, but it's worth struggling to try to find ways to work through those feelings. And so what are some of the ways that you might be able to work through those feelings? One thing that might be useful is to try to put the shoe on the other foot. If this was somebody else who had pulmonary hypertension or another chronic illness, would you leap to blaming them for having that illness? Most likely not. And so if you can find ways to be kind to yourself and give yourself credit rather than giving yourself guilt. Another thing that's another coping skill that's very relevant to coping with a chronic health condition is gathering information, learning as much as you can, but there's some caveats to that. And one of those caveats is to consider the source of the information. As you probably all already know, if you just Google pulmonary hypertension or any chronic health condition, a lot of stuff is going to come up, and it's going to be of quite variable quality. And it's important to get the accurate information and the useful information and to be able to sift through. And as I already mentioned, I've looked at the Pulmonary Hypertension Association website, and there is an unbelievable wealth of information on there, so that's a great starting point. And in terms of looking for information, I want to acknowledge that probably you're looking for different types of information. One is purely the factual. So, what is known, what are treatment options, getting basic information about the health condition. But the other thing that you may really be seeking is other patients' experiences. What is this? What might this be like to live with this chronic illness over time? And you can certainly find that on the web, and a lot of times what you might find is worst case doom and gloom scenarios with someone who may have the same diagnosis, but different differences that are important, where maybe the illness was caught later or at a different phase or whatever. And so just remembering that it's important to use a filter when you're reviewing any of this information, either other patients' experiences or the factual piece too. And just monitoring yourself as you get this information, how is it affecting you emotionally? Do you feel like it's helping decrease your worry, and that you feel like you're gaining power as you learn the information? That would be the ideal. That's great. But there may be times where you're seeking the information and you find that getting the information is kind of just stirring the pot and making you feel more anxious, and pay attention to that, and that's important. Set limits when you need to on seeking this additional information. Another key piece is thinking through what aspects of the situation are under your control. With a chronic health condition, I need to acknowledge that certainly there's so much that feels and is out of your control, but it can be useful to think through what are the pieces of this that I do have some control over, and then focusing on that and giving yourself credit for that. so that you're following up with your physicians, that you're following through with medical recommendations, taking medication as prescribed, or making lifestyle changes, any of those pieces. And there's a real value to acknowledging that. And at the end of the day, being able to give yourself credit for the energy that you put into doing, managing those things that are under your control. And being able to say at the end of the day, look, I'm doing everything I can to do the best I can in this situation. And that's got to be worth something. And so whenever possible, it's more useful to put your energy on the controllable rather the uncontrollable aspects of the situation. And so coping strategies for those controllable aspects of the situation are seeking information, setting goals, making plans and decisions, expressing your needs to your family members or other people who want to help you. And that might involve also requesting specific types of help. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But the question remains, what do you do about the uncontrollable aspects of the situation? And the truth is there are a lot of uncontrollable aspects. And so what do you do about that? Really, the goal here is to manage those negative emotions that are evoked by the uncertainty and by the uncontrollable aspects of the situation. And so how can you manage those negative emotions? So figuring out ways to accept or make peace with the situation. A lot of times, here's where faith is really an important coping resource for people. At times, managing those emotions by distracting yourself with activities that make you feel better. So it's kind of right back to the coping skills that we already mentioned. Do something that's pleasurable that helps you shift gears. It can be useful to talk to other people, so expressing those emotions. And I want to give you permission to allow yourself to worry, and allow yourself at times to just feel those unpleasant emotions. It's okay to worry at times. It's okay to feel sad or down, and acknowledge that you're in a situation that isn't what you would have asked for and isn't what you would have expected, and it's legitimate to be upset at times. Absolutely. And so the key is that on a limited basis piece. And I'll talk more about this later as well, but one of the useful ways for me to think about this is that it's okay to go there. You just don't want to park there. So you can have those unpleasant emotions, but you just don't want to get stuck. So at times it's useful to just feel your feelings and let yourself have them. But after a certain point in time, it's time to move on. Now it's time to engage in something else, so that you don't get too stuck just feeling the hard feelings. So final thoughts on coping skills before I move on to social support. Start with what already works for you. Remember that you are not starting at zero. I guarantee you that you are already doing some things right, and there are things that work for you that that the goal is just to be intentional about utilizing some of those coping skills that you already have. Another key point is that it's different strokes for different folks. Coping skills aren't one size fits all. If each person on this webinar made a list of your top 5 go-to coping skills, my list is only the best list for me. It's not the best list for everyone else. And each person on here might have their very own list. But the best list for you is the best list for you. And so giving yourself permission to find your own way of figuring out what it is that works best for you. And if you need to develop additional coping skills, experiment, keep an open mind, and consider working with a therapist, because that's someone who can help you think of new coping skills, sift through what do you want to try, and help you stay accountable. So a week or 2 weeks later, they can say, you said you were going to try X, Y, Z. Did you actually do that? Did you give it a fair shake? What got in the way? What do you think? What do you want to try next? It's a neutral third party who can help keep you accountable if you're experimenting with something new and need some help. So I'm shifting gears a little to social support, although it's not a 100% shift of gears, because one type of coping skill is to access social support. And so then the question there is, how can family members work together to cope with the stress of a chronic illness? And then beyond that, how can people outside of your family support your family as well? So those are important questions to think through. I want to acknowledge as well, though, that I'm fully aware that sometimes the social connections themselves are that source of stress. So as I've already mentioned before, that it can be difficult to place limits on things that you commit to doing. Often, people still expect you to be exactly who you were before you became ill. And what they don't necessarily see is that now you've got your shortness of breath, limited energy, fatigue. And so they're still asking a lot of you, and now you need to figure out how to say no, and that's hard to do. Another piece that can be quite challenging is figuring out how much information about your health condition you want to share with other people, and that's something more that something I'll talk about more in just a little bit. So a metaphor that I really like is that being diagnosed with a chronic illness is like being sent to live in a foreign country, all alone, suddenly, and against your will. So this is not like me being told today that I would get to live in Paris over the summer, which is something that would be fun, and it's a place I've always wanted to go, and I have a chance to prepare. This is like being told that I need to walk out my front door and get on a plane right now to live forever in a country that I've never wanted to live in, or maybe I've never even heard of. And so all of a sudden you have to learn this whole new language and culture. So bringing it back to the chronic illness, that you've all had to learn all this new medical language, all of how physicians' visits work and referrals and all of that. And just to acknowledge that legitimately it's a burden, it's a hardship, that's a lot to take on, and it takes a lot of energy at a time when it's most easy to be tired and panicked. So legitimately, that's a lot to take on. And then beyond that, the question is, who do you invite to visit you, and for how long are they allowed to stay, and when do you start inviting visitors? Because you're going to have to educate visitors, which takes even more energy. And so to keep going with that metaphor, so family members are really important visitors. But the questions are you willing to share this experience with them, or how much of this experience, or what parts of your experience? Oftentimes people withhold information, patients withhold information because they're trying to protect their family members. They're afraid of burdening people by sharing either their medical information or their feelings and fears. And so, is some of that going on? Are you keeping visitors out who would be willing to come and do this with you, but you're trying to protect them? Outside the family, with friends and acquaintances, it's a very legitimate question. How much information do you want to share, and with whom? And the thing is, there is no one right answer, and there's no easy answer. For each person, the question is, what is the right answer for you, which may change over time, from initial diagnosis to over the long haul. And there are probably different groups of people. How much you want to share with general acquaintances may be different than what you want to share with, aunts and uncles or people at your church or your closest friends. And so that becomes a lot to think through legitimately. And if there are kind of large groups of people that, those people that you run into in the grocery store that you don't really want to go into it, but you feel like you need to say something and that situation keeps popping up, it may be useful to think through ahead of time essentially what your kind of elevator speech is. What would be your pre-planned 2 to 3 sentence message that you want to deliver? And do you want that to be a message that ultimately is just a couple sentences that will close down further communication about this? Or do you want that to be something that would open up further discussion? And once again, there's no right answer. That's for you to figure out what you would want that to be. Other thoughts on social support, and I think I've already sent this message, but that you do deserve to be a high priority, that as a patient or as a caregiver, you need to make yourself a priority at times. And a reminder that relationships are a two-way street. So much of the time when I'm talking with patients, people say that, it's that they're very uncomfortable in the role of patient because they like to be the giver. They're always the go-to person. They always say yes. They like to help other people. And it's really, really uncomfortable to shift that around and to be in a position of receiving any kind of support or help. But the truth is, relationships are meant to be a two-way street, that each person in the relationship is sometimes a giver and sometimes a receiver, and that needs to be okay, and that honestly, a true legitimate relationship really has the two-way street element rather than only a one-way. And so friends and family genuinely want to help. The question is, are you willing to receive help, comfortable doing that? And beyond that, are you comfortable asking for specifically what you want and need? Often friends and family members don't know. They know that they want to help, but they don't know specifically how to help and what the best way is. And so that's up to you to think through, are you comfortable taking a little bit of control over that and sending out some clear messages about what you want? The classic example that I hear in talking to people is that they get 1 million casseroles, that when all else fails and people who want to help you and support you don't know what to do, they'll bring you dinner and they'll bring you lots of casseroles. And I talk all the time to people who say, I don't need 18 casseroles on Monday. What I need help with is someone driving the carpool on Wednesday afternoon or whatever. And so are you able to figure out what it is that would be most helpful to you? And are you comfortable sending out a message and asking for that? Because it can make a real difference to get the right type of help rather than lots of well-meaning casseroles that aren't helpful to you. Another thought on the social support is to consider whether you want to appoint a family member or close friend to manage some of those other social connections. It can take a lot of energy to update everyone who cares about you about what's going on with your health, especially if there's any kind of acute change or exacerbation or change in medication. So consider whether you want to utilize a point person who can communicate some of that on your behalf and take the burden off of you. Another important thing is role changes, and that you may have already had some changes in the roles, the things that you're able to do within your family due to changes in your health. And if it hasn't happened yet, you may anticipate that some role changes may need to happen in the future. And so what do you do about that? And it's back to that communication piece. Are you able to discuss with your family members and the key people who are involved how you want to manage those role changes? And I'm going to talk a little bit on kind of both sides of the coin about role changes. On the one hand, if you are needing to give up some important roles to you, I want to give you full permission to grieve. Those are legitimate losses when you have to give things up simply due to your health that you did not want to give up yet by any means. But also there's a value of focusing on the roles that you still fill. So there's both the losses, but also hopefully legitimate, important things that you are still doing. And recognize, rather than feeling guilty about some of the role changes, recognizing that it's not necessarily negative for other family members to take on some new roles. So for example, older kids or teenagers, if they take on more of the housework, that's not necessarily a bad thing at all for them to start learning those things they're going to need to be independent adults eventually. One thing that I want to acknowledge is that roles, they're not just about what we do and how we spend our time, but they really tie into identity and self-worth. So an example of that is, I keep our house clean, therefore I'm a valuable person. And on the surface, it seems like there's nothing wrong with that, but over time, as I get more and more fatigued and it turns out that the house isn't staying as clean anymore, then if I look around and see the house getting the house isn't as clean anymore, or somebody else has taken that on, do I see that and then tell myself I'm a worthless person? I'm a worthless person because I'm not cleaning the toilets. I'm a worthless person because someone else is doing it. And that's where there's the negative aspect of tying our identity and self-worth into our roles. So it's important to be aware of that so that you don't fall in a pit of feeling like you're worthless in the face of some of these role changes. And so if there are role changes and identity changes, make sure that you can still identify positive aspects of yourself. And the key positive aspects of yourself might be something different now than it was 3 to 5 years ago. But there are many important ways to contribute to your family and to society, and that those ways for you may be evolving over time. So as a wrap up on social support, take some time to think about how you want to handle some of your most common social challenges, which may revolve around how much information about your health condition you want to share. Kind of a sub-part on that is, do you want to be educating other people about the health condition that you have? Is that a role that you want to take on or not? There's no right or wrong answer, but certainly there are a fair number of patients that I talk to, especially with these misunderstood or health conditions that other people have never even heard of, that a useful role that patients get to a point where they enjoy doing is really educating other people so that they understand these health conditions. Again, I'm not saying you need to go down that road. It's different strokes for different folks, but that may or may not be a role that you want to take on. And another potential social challenge is how you want to handle some well-meaning comments, especially with a chronic lung condition. Since your lungs are invisible, it's often hard for people to understand, and especially when it happens when you're young, and so you may hear those comments, you're too young to be sick, but you don't look sick. And what do you want to do about that? Do you want to invest the energy in trying to help people understand what you're going through or not? And only you know the right answer for you.